Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel organized by the World Innovation Summit for Education, WISE, which is an initiative of Qatar Foundation for Education, Science and Community Development. My name is Ahmed Baghdadi. I'm a research manager at WISE, and I'm happy to be the moderator for this panel. This panel is part of the Global Learning Festival 2020, which is held virtually from September 1st to 4th. As we all know, as a result of the current COVID-19 pandemic, communities around the world are trying to transform their learning systems to ensure resilience, inclusivity, and impact on a digital frontier. And language is a key component of our learning systems. Building off of the WISE research report entitled Language Policies in Globalized Contexts, which was published by WISE in 2019 in partnership with Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar, this discussion will explore how multilingualism challenges education systems to examine how they develop their communities to be cohesive and to value individual identities of the community. This report, published by WISE and Carnegie Mellon University, is available to download for free at wise-qatar.org. Informed by the current global health situation, this panel will focus on how the super diversity of cities today changes the nature of policy responses, especially regarding which languages to teach and to teach in. Before I introduce the panelists for today, I would like to mention that this panel will run for 1 hour, and we're planning to have a discussion with the panelists for about 45 minutes, and hope to have around 15 minutes towards the end for questions from the audience. So please write your questions in the chat box, and we'll hope to try to answer as many of them as possible. I'm pleased and honored to welcome a group of expert panelists today who will share their insights and experiences on the topic of this panel. I'm pleased and honored to welcome Dudley Reynolds, who is a teaching professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. Dudley has been a teacher and a researcher for over 30 years, and has served as president of TESOL International, which is the Association for Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages, in 2016 and 2017. He is also the author of the WISE research report we're discussing today. I'm also pleased and honored to welcome Aline Sarah, who is the co-founder and CEO of Natakallam. Natakallam is a social enterprise that connects refugees and displaced persons with work opportunities in the language sector through the freelance economy. And I'm also happy to welcome Laurie Noel, who has been a journalist and writer for 25 years. He's written for publications in Australia, the UK, Canada, and his work has been published in the Herald Sun, the Guardian, the Times, and the Daily Mail. He's currently working in media and public affairs for migrant refugees, settlement agency AMAS in Australia. Dudley, Aline, and Laurie, welcome to this panel, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to start this discussion by sort of a big picture question about how can we break social barriers through language teaching in our societies, and what are the best practices in this regard. I'd like to start with Dudley. If you could share with us your thoughts on how we can break social barriers through language teaching.
I think, the start to answer that question is looking at where the social barriers are coming from. And one of the patterns that we see worldwide, and especially in cities, is increasing diversification as a result of migration. And this isn't going to change, and it's a reality that cities everywhere are dealing with. And as current communities of migrants get larger, and as new migrant groups move into community, there's always been a tendency to stick together from communities within the larger community. And if we're not careful, those communities begin to erect barriers between them. And I think that we have to recognize the essential role of language learning in breaking down those barriers. And when I'm talking about language learning, I'm not just talking about a one-way type of relationship where the host community says they need to learn our language in order to be part of our community. What I'm talking about is a much more reciprocal understanding of language learning, where cities make an effort to encourage the learning of new languages that are being brought into their community. They support programs that teach community languages. And this is good for two reasons. One, obviously when we learn someone else's language, then we can see the world through their eyes. We can empathize. We can share information with them. But also just the very process of language learning in a formal setting in a classroom puts people from different communities in contact with each other. And it leads to friendships, it leads to relationship building. And that goes a long way, I think, in breaking down the tendency that exists everywhere to erect barriers.
Dudley, based on my experience as a teacher and in my classes, I used to, notice that students don't only learn from the teacher, they learn from one another. And if someone is, most of them might not be native speakers of the language, and they have different backgrounds and different, proficiency levels, so they might actually learn from each other. Have you seen this in your experience?
Absolutely, and I mean, you have to think about what is the content of language classes, right? It's not just grammar instruction. It is often questions about values. It's questions about how do you do this, what's your process for doing something, whether it's cooking, whether it's teaching a practice to your children, whatever it is. And in this way, students become informants for each other, right? And so there's often as much peer learning going on in a language classroom as there is a teacher pushing out some kind of knowledge.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Laurie. Laurie, I know you work through your job with AMES Australia with migrant communities, and you write about that, and you're engaged in discussions around language in the migrant communities. What are your thoughts on how we can break social barriers through language teaching?
Well, I think language is very important in breaking down social barriers, and I think what Dudley said about it being not just a one-way street is really important. I mean, a lot of the work we do is to help communities tell their own authentic stories in the mainstream media here, so that there's some understanding in the broader society of their cultures and their traditions. And I guess, Australia's, it's kind of unique in that, it traditionally was a sort of monolingual settler society, but in the last 30 years, it's become one of the most diverse countries in the world, if not the most diverse. A third of us were born overseas, and half of us have at least one parent who was born overseas. And in the last 30 years, the majority of those migrants have come from countries where English is not the main language. And we found that communities that are confident in their own culture and able to preserve and access their own language and traditions they're also more confidently and successfully engaging with mainstream society. And we see this all the time in lots of communities. So, and the basis to this is language. Language is kind of everything. It in a sense, defines a community. And if there's a broader understanding in the wider society that these languages are important, then that kind of builds on social cohesion, and it becomes a really important factor in having a cohesive society.
Thank you. I think Australia would probably be a perfect example for us to consider here, given the diversity and the migrants and the settlers and the original people in the country. So this is interesting. Aline, I know you work with migrants, but maybe in a slightly different way. You don't necessarily teach them language, but you actually enable them to teach their own language to others. Would you mind sharing your thoughts about how this can break social barriers within a society, especially with regards to migrants?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Yes, I am the co-founder of Natakallam, which is a social enterprise that hires refugees as language teachers over the internet. So echoing what has already been said by the panelists, language is a window into the world. Language is a window into other cultures, and it's absolutely critical to foster understanding and to kind of bridge the gaps between the different cultures in the world, especially as communities diversify and people are more mobile and migrating much more. I would say that the particularity of what we're doing is twofold with Natakallam, because while we are trying to create an understanding of different cultures, we're also trying to create an understanding of migrants, and particularly for Natakallam's case, refugees. Unfortunately, we're living in a world where there is a rise of populism, and there is overall a negative view of people migrating for whether it's due to war or natural disaster or for economic purposes. So what Natakallam does is not only bring languages to people who might not speak them as they're signing up to learn them, but their teacher is a refugee, and that enables them to also change their mindset and see a different image than what might be painted in the media and political spheres, and seeing really that migrants are just like you and me. We're all similar people with similar goals and ambitions, and refugees especially have just been subject to extraordinary circumstances that have forced them to flee.
And you've been doing this for a number of years, I understand. And could you tell us a little about how successful this has been so far?
Yes, sure. So Natakallam was born out of Lebanon in light of the Syrian refugee crisis. I'm myself Lebanese, born and raised in the US. And the idea was, how can we enable Syrian refugees in Lebanon who are typically barred from the local economy, not given a right to work, and suffer discrimination like many refugees, regardless of what country they find themselves in. Well, the idea was they have an innate skill, which is their language. And across the world, people are looking to learn languages. Many people who learn languages need to practice through conversation. And so the idea was very simple. What if we could create a platform, which is what we did, that enabled people around the world, mostly Americans, I would say we started with, who could learn Arabic, or at the very least practice speaking Arabic with refugees who would be in Lebanon, who can't actually get a full-time employment, but could then be paid to be the language partner of these individuals worldwide. So since the founding in 2015, so we're going on 5 years old, Natakallam has actually expanded. So we do work with many Syrian refugees, but we've expanded to other Arabic-speaking refugee communities, Iraqis, Palestinian, Yemeni. Unfortunately, there's many refugee populations in the Middle East to choose from. We've also launched Persian with Iranian and Afghan refugees, Spanish with Venezuelan and Central American refugees, as well as French with Francophone African refugees. And so we're going on 5 years, and we've connected with thousands of students, but also have our programs running in schools and universities. And the Qatar Foundation has been a significant supporter of ours for this work. And we're excited to be hitting $1 million in disbursements to refugees as well in the next couple of months.
Wow, this sounds amazing, and it's super diverse as well. Well, speaking of that super diversity now, my next question is about how the super diversity of cities today changed the nature of policy responses, especially with regards to language teaching. And more specifically, which languages do we teach in, and which languages do we teach? And I'd like to ask this question specifically to Dudley and see, based on the report, what do you think? How do you think we should consider languages to teach in the classroom and the language of instruction?
Yeah, and I'm going to repeat something I already said, which is that we have to move away from this mindset that when someone comes into our community, the only aspect of language learning that we need to worry about is teaching them our language. And what we're seeing, every individual has a need to connect to their history, their identity. They need to be part of a community and, in terms of social cohesion. And they also need economic opportunity. And economic opportunity in today's world often touches on globalization and having language skills that allow you to work not only within your local place of living, but also worldwide. And so what schools and communities are increasingly having to do is find ways to support a very sort of complex matrix of needs. And they're having to do it in a way, in a situation where the languages that each student or that satisfy each student's needs are different. You're no longer teaching to a classroom where you've got 30 students and in particular their heritage languages are all the same, or even the languages that they want to learn for wider opportunity outside the community are the same. And so we're having to come up with new models for language instruction that support the learning of multiple languages at the same time. Cities are having to come up with ways to support programs for many different languages. And there's some great models out there that I can talk about if you're interested. But it's how you deal and support diversity at the same time. I mean, I like to use the phrase that what we're no longer just teaching multilingualism. We're teaching in every classroom multilingualisms, right? We're encouraging each student to be multilingual in whatever configuration matches their needs. And that's a very different paradigm.
I totally agree. I think Qatar is a perfect example for this. And if you can tell us a little bit about how teaching languages or teaching in a specific or multilingual languages in Qatar happens, and if there's anything that we can learn from that.
Yeah, I think, at the classroom level in particular, I think we've got to get away from the notion that in order to, teach a language, you have to restrict conversation in the classroom to just that language. And instead realize that it's possible to, in a sense, license multiple languages in a classroom, and that the focus is much more on understanding language and how language works as a mode of communication, as a sort of matching of resources, to communicative needs. It's about understanding what our communicative needs are, and really sort of, in a sense, building this meta-awareness, not just memorization of vocabulary or grammar rules, and that's what language teaching is. And there are lots of classrooms in Qatar where they are adopting this this mode, and I had a chance to work some with the Qatar Foundation schools and Qatar Academy schools that are really pioneering some of these methods because they have such diverse classrooms.
Yeah, I think it's perfect here to see students from various backgrounds in the same school, in the same classroom, learning, in multiple languages. I think that would be a pioneer, as you said. I'd like now to focus more on the impact of teaching migrants the local language on their ability to integrate into the society, and there could be some direct and indirect, impacts of that. Laurie, based on your experience and your work with the migrant communities in Australia, What do you see as the impact of teaching the migrants the local language?
Well, I guess at a fundamental level, it's what we do. We support around 70,000 newly arrived migrants and refugees to settle in Australia every year. And what is critical in successful settlement for most people is economic participation. So for most people, that means finding a job or starting a business. And having enough English to achieve that is vital for most people. And so having this economic participation leads to social participation and access to mainstream society, which in turn builds social cohesion across the whole of society. So it's very important that I think that people learn the language of the workplace when they arrive in a new society. Just last week, our federal government kind of recognised this and made available unlimited free English language tuition to anyone who's living here as a permanent resident. So that's a sort of quite a major step for them, and I guess it's underpinned by the government's desire to invest in people to make sure that set them up for success in terms of their economic participation in this country, and it was broadly welcomed.
Right. And did you notice any differences between the migrant communities and refugee communities? I mean, for migrants, they usually come in through the standard immigration programs, and they have to prove they have specific, certain level of English proficiency. But the refugees might not have this, this level. So, did you notice any differences?
Yeah, no, there are different cohorts of people. I mean, most of the skilled migrants who come here will have, reasonably good English. But maybe refugee communities who we accept something like 20,000 refugees every year, and many of them have no English, and some of them are not literate in their own language. So these programs that are run exist at several levels to cater for people with different levels of literacy. And there are also categories of people such as the spouses of skilled migrants who may not have much English, and it's important that they are able to, navigate the society and speak to their kids' teachers and just sort of operate in the community. So, it's good that there are these programs that help people reach a level of English that suits their circumstances.
Interesting. Elaine, have you noticed any economic impact? I see you're helping migrants become teachers or teach on a freelance basis. Does this have a significant economic impact on their situation and how they can settle in and sort of integrate in the society?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's when we talk about refugees and migrant, it's it's such a large population, and so many people are in different situations. So a Syrian in Lebanon, who is actually not even recognized by the Lebanese government as a refugee, his or her situation is going to be very different than a Syrian or an Iraqi or an Afghan in Germany, and that will be different than a Venezuelan in Costa Rica. So I think, for me, it's very important to always kind of acknowledge the nuances, and that when we're speaking, we're kind of generalizing quite a bit, and that each experience is very different. The core segment of the population we started to focus on when we were born was refugees in quote unquote limbo situations, meaning they fled the immediate violence in their homeland, and they've crossed a border to a country where they are not allowed to stay, and they are not given a right to work, and they are struggling to get to Europe or to Australia or to Canada, where they would actually, either claim asylum and get accepted, or file for, or hope to get through the complex resettlement system, formally resettled. And the chances of that happening for refugees who are kind of in that situation is actually less than 1%. So it is a terrifying number. It is a catastrophic situation. And so, what we saw, the whole European refugee crisis, which is relative, because I think, the Middle East and other parts of the world, they have a real refugee crisis. But what people try to do is get on their own to places like Germany, which back then was granting you asylum if you crossed the border and made it there. So our goal was really to try and support those people in this complete in-between situation who have really no prospects ahead of them, really struggling, and they don't really know what's going to happen. And so that's why, in Lebanon, that was the focus. It was, middle upper class Syrians who are highly skilled, but really don't have a future ahead right now. And actually, of course, we've expanded. We do have different profiles because we noticed that when refugees, for example, Syrians who get to Italy, they don't speak Italian, even though they have been granted, the refugee status. They struggle to get access to work and an income because language is indeed a significant barrier. And so what Natakellam enables them to do is to actually sustain themselves while they are adapting to this new life, learning Italian. And I mean, it is also quite amazing to see the resilience and the capacity for these individuals to learn those languages. For Natakellam, in terms of income provided, about 60% of the refugees we work with, Natakellam is their only source of income for them and for their families. And based on the profile, some of them are pretty much making the amount of a full-time job. Especially, we've also added translation services. We do programs in schools. So our goal at Natakellam is actually to try and make it as close as possible to being, a full-time compensation. And that's why we don't have thousands of refugees working at Natakellam, because we'd rather have in-depth impact. And so it means that one tutor will be working with dozens of students, because one student might be 1 to 2 hours per week, rather than having thousands of refugees who teach 1 or 2 hours per week. So no, the impact is significant. And what I would say is it's the sense of dignity and purpose, which is the most powerful, because refugees, unfortunately, the way we look at refugees instead of as heroes is very different. And what we see is that the friendship and the sense of empowerment and the pride they get from teaching their language and their culture and making the world realize who they are, where they're from, why they've fled, the psychosocial impact is very important and very powerful as well.
I can imagine. I think it would change lives, by becoming a teacher. They don't sit in a classroom, but they actually do the same job as a teacher virtually. And on top of that, they earn, decent income. So that's actually very good.
Ahmed, can I
yes,
jump
please.
in? This is Dudley. Because I think there's something really interesting that connects the answer that Lori just said with Aline's, which is the connection between language teaching and learning and economic empowerment. And we've always thought about economic empowerment as coming from learning the language that you need to operate in the new community. But economic empowerment also depends on a sense of identity and a sense of self-worth. And one of the really neat things about Natakellam is that it positions the refugee as an expert based on their knowledge of their own language, right? And it builds that sense of, I can do this. Look, I do have something to contribute to my new, either new place of residence or place that I want to head towards. And, and I think that that's getting back to that first question about what is it that cities can do. And if we think about language teaching and learning programs that position new members of our communities as experts and as people with knowledge to share and give back to the community, that we create that can-do sense that then leads to entrepreneurship activities and a whole range of ways of economic empowerment beyond what used to be thought of as migrants being just tracked into the lowest paid entry-level jobs in a society.
Dudley, do you see a role for schools to play here? And should we engage schools in providing those programs, or maybe those programs should be implemented by other city organizations?
Absolutely. In the report, I talk about kind of as a case study, Ottawa in Ontario, where you've got, first of all, a need to teach two national languages, English and French. You have an extremely diverse population in terms of the, different, if you look at the census data, the number of languages that have a significant enough population to actually show up in the census data and not just be listed as other. It's a really long list. And the schools there have come up with a way in which if a group of 23 people from the community petition the school board for a language program, the school board will provide essentially a classroom on Saturday morning or after school. They will provide training for someone from the community to teach that language, right? And they will advertise it. And so many of these programs become first and foremost a way for migrants to pass on a heritage language to their children, right? In a school setting, but then they also become a way for other community members, especially in adult classes, to learn, pick up a new language through these. So it's not just, to heritage speakers. And that program is channeled through the schools because the schools have classroom space. They also have expertise in teacher training and even curriculum development, right? And so they can work with communities to develop these programs.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. And Aline, I wonder if you have a similar experience working with schools. Probably if you could share briefly with us how you help migrants through schools.
Yes, sure. So we work with universities and we work with schools. The university programs are typically bringing Natakallam as a complement to language teaching. So people taking Arabic, we work with the professors to integrate practicing what's being taught in the classroom through Natakallam. So Natakallam is effectively playing kind of the role of the language lab, which also in turn enables students to learn about the refugee crisis, about refugees, what their day-to-day life is like, but at the same time very strictly kind of following what is asked from the professors to help reach the level of the practicing with the native speakers. So that's the more traditional model of partnerships with universities, though we've also been added as a complement to classrooms on anthropology, on migration issues, on politics, political science, human rights, because of course these are hands-on experiences and wonderful testimonies for students to learn from directly. When we come to the classroom program, which is younger learners, so it's K-12, this is, we've created our own curriculum, and it's, you can do 1 hour, 5 hours, or 10 hours. And it's a combination, of course, we work around the request of the teachers as well, but it's not as much language, it's language, but also, again, the journey of displacement to try and raise awareness with children at a young age about why people are fleeing, why do you only hear about war in the Middle East. And so it's quite an incredible experience and phenomenon really to see, for example, young American kids in Kentucky who knows where they're hearing about the Middle East and what they're hearing about refugees, because the news, unfortunately, as I mentioned, is not the best source, but they actually get to meet refugees this way. And so there's an integration of a little bit of conversational language teaching, but also really the journey of being a displaced person. And it's really actually very powerful. We've seen people who really came from a complete different political perspective, and conversation is so powerful, really. Conversation can do wonders in changing people's minds.
I'm sure it does. Yeah, it's genuine and it's, one-to-one, and I can imagine how how powerful this can be in bridging cultures and um, the current situation with COVID-19 might have changed things probably for you, Aline, and for Laurie, and probably Dudley can also tell us about that. But I will leave this open for all panelists or who would be interested to jump in and share with us how you think the current crisis has affected the way we use language to communicate, whether in the classroom or outside the classroom.
So we in Australia think we do multiculturalism very well, but we've had an interesting time here in Melbourne in the past few months where, unlike the rest of the country, we've had a second wave of the coronavirus, and these cases have, I guess, disproportionately affected new and emerging communities. And the local health authorities and the state government kind of thought they knew how to communicate with these communities, but it turns out they didn't. And so it's been really interesting to watch the kind of catch-up work that's been going on, and we've been helping with that a little bit. But it's really about, I guess, understanding the way communities, speak within themselves and to other communities, the nuances of language, dialects, and also, I guess, using, trusted voices from within these communities to get those messages out about health and hygiene and, the dangers of the virus. So it's been really interesting to watch that as a sort of public policy response, slightly gone wrong, if you know what I mean.
Right. Thank you. Dudley, do you have anything to share on this question?
I mean, I think the pandemic experience has been, an incredible learning opportunity for all of us. And when it comes to language teaching, I mean, one of the first things I think it's done is, in a sense, encouraged a whole lot of language teachers around the world to buy into what Aline already knows, which is that you can provide remote instruction in language, and you can do it quite effectively. You can have conversations just like we're having that are great experiences in live use of language. And you can bring opportunities to classrooms that people never imagined before remote instruction. I think the other thing which I see it as creating an opportunity that I hope will stick around after the pandemic is because students are learning from their homes, they are spending more time with their extended family, right? And they are having to interact with that extended family for quite simply a greater number of hours every day. And that extended family is becoming a resource. And they should be a resource for language learning, right? If your grandmother is the one who's watching you every day, then I hope you're learning to communicate in your grandmother's language, right? And take advantage of this. And I think that's something that teachers, by the kinds of activities they come up with, can actually actively encourage. Go out and interview someone. Find this information out. If it's in another language, translate it in a way that you can then communicate it to the other students in your classroom. And that encourages students to begin to take on that role of being a language broker, a language go-between. And so there are positive opportunities if we think about how to take advantage of them.
Well, I agree. This crisis did not bring only challenges; it also brought opportunities for reimagining and revisiting what we do, and probably thinking about opportunities for transforming our learning systems and our education systems. Well, post-pandemic, I mean, we hope that this will be over soon as possible, with a vaccine or with anything else. But we hope that in a few months or early next year, we'll be able to get back to what we used to do. But should we do things differently? What would we do differently going forward? And that applies to schools and cities.
So I think,
yeah, Laurie, please.
The thing we've seen around communicating during the COVID crisis is just what we're doing now. It's connecting remotely, as Dudley said, using technology that didn't exist even a decade ago. So that's a great opportunity to make, and for us especially when we're trying to provide flexible learning opportunities for refugees and migrants. This kind of technology can be really useful. For instance, for a mother who's looking after children but also trying to learn English or anything else, a vocational skill. So there's a great opportunity to make learning of any kind more accessible and more flexible into the future. And I think this will be one of the great, I guess, lessons from the pandemic.
Yeah, I would add that I think unfortunately that the pandemic's impact will be devastating. We've seen the economic impact, and of course, migrants and refugees are extra vulnerable and will be the most hit. That being said, typical entrepreneur mindset is, you got to find the silver lining and the opportunity in the challenge. And I think, yes, it is been wonderful to see that there are ways to find how, as Dudley was saying, that you can learn and teach a language virtually. Of course, nothing will replace that immersion and that study abroad experience. But for the time being, we're still able to do that. And interestingly, for Natakallam, during the confinement period, actually there was a tripling of the number of people signing up for Natakallam classes. So while it was much harder, just everyone in general was suffering more, we were actually able to disperse more income to the refugees who work on our platform. And if anyone following the language space saw such a surge in all of the language apps and the language programs online, and hopefully, because so many people have this I have free time, I can learn a language, but how can we shift that to, it's not because I have free time that I'm learning a language, it's because learning a language is priceless and transformative. And so how can we make people now continue to not look at this as an extra, but as a core and powerful aspect for people's careers, but for the world, and for building bridges and fostering understanding. So I think if of course from a policy perspective, I'm sad to say that I believe that there are terrible budget cuts going on in the US around language teaching, which is of course catastrophic, and the last thing I think that is needed in the US right now. So I think that we should push for more funding of language learning and push for making it more common. And I would just give an example from just Lebanese tend to be bilingual, trilingual, and they are, of course, our country is crumbling, but the diaspora is typically doing all quite well, and we often attribute it to the fact that they speak French, English, Arabic. So it is quite interesting. And my personal journey has been that I feel I can connect with French people, I can connect with Anglophones, Middle Easterners, and also I was privileged to learn Spanish and also that way as well. So I think language is priceless and should become part of the core education system wherever we are, I would say. And I think it's wonderful that Australia is providing free English tuition to anyone based there. I think that's amazing as well, because it is of course a huge challenge for refugees, the language barrier when they migrate.
Yeah, I can't stress this enough. It's I think it's crucially important for people to learn language, not only for the job opportunities it opens or for the, economic prospects, but also for cultural understanding and cross-cultural collaboration and cooperation among people of different backgrounds. This actually leads me to the next question regarding how local governments can empower refugees and migrant communities to preserve their own language and culture while actually supporting them to integrate into the new community. I don't know if Dudley, do you have any, what's your take on this?
Well, I mean, I think this sort of circles back around a number of themes we've been talking about. And so there are clear ways that programs can be set up. And those require, the programs start with a policy and intention on the part of local governments in terms of community, schooling, and school boards as well. But I think it's also, we have to think about this wider thing. And with the question you just asked about kind of takeaways from the pandemic, I think one of the things is both, Eileen talked about the incredible opportunity that language learning brings. I think we also need to remember, ignore language learning at your peril. How many public health ministries around the world have been, going crazy trying to figure out how to get public health messages out in multiple languages because they hadn't built the language resources in their community to reach out to all of the members of the community. And we are all in this together. And we've got to be able to speak each other's languages. We've got to be able to work with each other. And we can't achieve that by asking people to subvert or submerge the languages that they're comfortable using, right? We have to acknowledge that and build that up. And so it's kind of a rambling answer to your question, but I do think it's important to think about the overall ramifications.
Right, absolutely. Gloria, given the context you're in, several diverse migrant communities, how can governments deal with that and enable migrants to celebrate their own culture, but also merge into the new society?
Well, I'm no expert on that, but there's a couple of things I could say. And one is we have a thing in Australia called SBS, which is a special broadcasting service. So it's a publicly funded broadcaster that was set up about 40 years ago by a progressive government, but it's got broad support and it's going strong. And it produces programs on radio and TV in about 68 languages. And it's become this national institution that sort of supports communities to preserve their own culture, helps them tell their authentic stories. And it also connects them to sort of, mainstream Australia through things like in-language news broadcasts and, other programming. But then at a kind of, I guess, local government level, there's a lot of funding here for things like cultural festivals, which are organised by communities themselves. But in the last decade or so, they've become really popular. People from beyond the communities have been attending them in droves. And also local government libraries are now a huge resource for people from diverse communities in terms of, learning English, finding out about their own culture, or even accessing services and finding out, how you get to see an orthopedic specialist or, what special education means for your children. So, there are lots of things that can be done on a sort of program level, but it requires investment. It requires people who hold the purse strings to understand the importance of investing in communities so that you do build social cohesion. And you know, the more you do that, the more welcome people from overseas are in a country when they arrive. You know, it's a lesson that's been sort of hard learned here. I mean, we're protected from a lot of the, I guess, more nationalistic, populistic politics in a way, but there's still an undercurrent of people who don't see migration as a good thing, and you know, we need to be vigilant about those things.
Well, yeah, I think there will be a need for a lot of advocacy work, you know, not only for language, but for education in general. And as Aline said, we need to ensure that there will be enough investment and funding for education post-pandemic, so we ensure that, you know, what was lost in the past 6 months and probably for the next few months until this is over is made up for, and hopefully we can build on, you know, for the future. I think we're almost we're over time actually for the panel discussion, and I would like to thank all three panelists. I've received a few questions from my colleagues supporting the panel, and I would like to move to these questions for the next 7 or 8 minutes or so. So we have a question from AK, and this is basically regarding the Rohingya refugees who don't speak Bengali or English. And you know, they face a lot of challenges in Bangladesh when they move to Bangladesh, and you know, and people don't speak their language there. So what are the options to help them learn the language in their host country? I know that we're not pushing for you know, migrants to ignore the language and learn a foreign language, but are there any ways the local society can support them learn the local language in Bangladesh? I don't know if Dudley may have any experience with that.
So there are different models around the world, and unfortunately, in my mind, one of the most common models is this notion that someone has to learn the language before they can do anything else. And this impacts school children in particular, who may have started school in their country of origin or not, but then they're put into a new system and they're told, well, you know, study the language until you're ready to go back to school. And that's, you know, a real loss of time. And so I think it's developing systems that allow people to continue learning and using the resources that they have, while at the same time adding additional languages into that mix. And it's a process of empowerment. It's a process of adding on. It's a process of seeing relations between languages. And you know, I often remind people that the people who gain the most economic benefit from language learning, if we're going to focus just on economic benefit, are the ones who actually are competent in multiple languages, not the people who've transitioned from one language to another and forgotten the original one along the way. And so it's designing educational programs that focus on all of education, adding new language into the mix, realizing that language teaching is as much about providing input and making it, getting people to notice it, figure it out, solve it as a puzzle, see how it relates to what they already know, and designing your programs in that way.
Thank you. Thanks, Dudley. Aline, do you work with any refugees in Bangladesh or in any neighboring countries?
Unfortunately, that's out of our scope for the time being. But I mean, I think it is, you know, one thing to say is as I mentioned, there's such different categories and profiles in the refugee community. And one thing I would say is that we've had instances of, I mean, as I mentioned, Natakalam chose to focus its impact on the middle upper class community of refugees who are skilled and have been robbed from a future. And this is a decision we've made from an impact perspective, because when we talk about refugees and migrants, the crisis is so massive, you have to choose where you're taking action. But what we've seen and what we've had is actually many people come and want to fund lessons for refugees who don't speak and who aren't bilingual. And so we'll have Syrians who arrive to the US who don't speak English and who are being taught by our Syrian tutors who are bilingual. And I think this is an interesting model because these populations have endured trauma and are struggling. And so when they're taught by someone who has a similar background, basically they're the same background, they come from the same country, there might be an interesting dynamic that might make it more comfortable for them to learn this language. So this might be a model that can be explored, for example, with the Rohingya, finding certain of the population of the displaced who could be themselves teaching their fellow nationals. But I would say that is not my my area of expertise.
No, yeah, I understand, but this is actually the model you follow can be, replicated in other contexts, and
Yeah.
I'm hoping to, to see another, social enterprise taking care of this in other contexts in Bangladesh. Thank you. Another question that came from Isan Deleri. This is basically about the danger of extension of native languages, which happen to be in many communities in Australia. How can we make sure that people maintain their native language from a policy level? And I wonder if Laurie can address that question.
Yeah, it's very difficult. There are literally, I don't know how many, but more than 200 native languages in Australia, and many of them have disappeared forever, unfortunately. But there's a lot of work being done recently to try to preserve what's left and even resurrect some that had thought to be lost. I'm not an expert on the subject, but I know that there is an agency in Canberra, in the capital, that has begun a lot of research into this, recruited a lot of experts from, or at least language speakers from Indigenous communities, and it's beginning to become quite a strong focus of our national reconciliation effort, which is seeing Indigenous people about to be recognised in the Constitution, and a whole lot of work done to try and improve, I guess, educational and levels and rates of poverty amongst some of the communities. So it's a work in progress, but it's obviously becoming much more important in the minds of a lot of people.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think again Australia is a case in point here. I think we have about 1 minute left, so I'd like to address this next question to Dudley. This is a question from Sin Den about the challenges that EFL teachers, English as foreign language teachers, encounter in a class of culturally diverse refugees and migrants. Dudley, I know you work with teachers and you train teachers.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges that EFL teachers encounter when they have, refugees from different cultural backgrounds?
So, I think first, this goes back also to kind of the model that Aline shared. There's real value when a teacher models being multilingual and what it means to be multilingual, because what we're really teaching, we're not teaching English, we're teaching students to be multilingual. And multilingualism goes with a whole set of behaviors, and it's knowing that there are situations where you can mix multiple languages at the same time because of who you're talking with, and it's fun that you can be creative in that way, something we often refer to as translanguaging. It is learning how to become good at translating, become good at using one language maybe to plan, another language to present. And even if the language profile of the teacher, in terms of the competencies that the teacher has, doesn't match the profile of the students because they're diverse, you still can model these processes and then encourage the students to do them with their own languages, encourage them to the extent that they can, learn from their peers in the classroom that may share some of their competencies. And you have to design exercises and activities that allow students to help each other with learning. It's not only the teacher's responsibility.
Right. Well, I think this requires actually, involvement of curriculum developers and teacher trainers.
Absolutely.
And,
Yeah.
a lot of work in this regard.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for all our panelists and for the participants who joined us. I think we're 1 minute over time, so it's probably time to wrap this up. I would like to thank Dudley Reynolds, teaching professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University, Aline Sarah, the co-founder and CEO of Natakallem, and Laurie Unwell, the media manager from AMES in Australia. And I encourage the participants to try to download the report from the WISE website and hopefully join us for future events. Thank you very much.